Let's do it. Let's talk about how to taste bourbon whiskey. I'm not talking about like how to host a tasting. I'm not talking about how to put the liquid in your mouth. I'm talking about like how to taste it and be like, oh, in this particular whiskey, which I have none of right now, I taste this or that or the other. It's easy to make fun of whiskey or bourbon tasting notes because generally they all sound the same. It's caramel, vanilla, oak, and a little spice. But there's more to that if you want to find it. So if you want to learn how to taste whiskey, bourbon whiskey specifically, we're going to get into it. First, I should probably start with whiskey. That's step one, is get some whiskey. So what should I have today? We'll start with a little Elijah Craig barrel proof. This is batch C918. So September 2018, this was released. Not my favorite Elijah Craig barrel proof batch I ever had. But they're never bad, so it's just a question of how amazing is it. This one is less amazing. Now, how do we learn to taste this thing? Well, some people will start with glassware. How do we serve it? We could serve it like this, which is a pretty classy way of drinking whiskey. Pretty social with our heavy-bottomed whiskey glass. This is actually funny story. Crown Royal glass. I do not like Crown Royal, but I found this glass and another glass, exactly the same, at Goodwill, and I was like, that is a whiskey glass, no doubt. But then my daughter, my 3-year-old, broke one. But most people wouldn't point you in this direction to taste whiskey. They might point you in this direction. This is called a Glencairn. This is specifically designed to taste, and it's actually a Scotch glass first and foremost. That's how they came to be. I mean, Scotches are called Glen whatever, right? Glenlivet, Glenfarclas, Glenfiddich, Glen Kinchy, Glen Roths. Lots of Glens up in Scotland. And so I think that's probably where Glencairn comes from as well. But the theory is that, you know, the liquid goes in the bottom and then the aromas funnel to the top, making them more accessible to your nose. You can also use, hold on. Brandy snifter. Stemmed. I have no idea what this is for, but I like it. It's kind of fancy. So if I ever want to feel really pretentious, I use that guy. Heck, though, I mean, use a freaking pint glass. I don't care. Like, if you're just starting tasting, you're not going to find much difference in what you perceive in these guys. Even me, I've been tasting crap for a long time. I actually learned to taste with coffee. So I'm wearing my coffee and beer shirt. I am the director of retail and operations at a co-owner of a specialty coffee company. And that specialty coffee that's the top notch of coffee. So I know how to taste things. I've learned how to quality grade coffee. To do that, you have to be a pretty good taster. And so that transposes then into other beverages, at least a little bit. And honestly, like, what I taste on a given day in whiskey just depends more on what I've eaten generally that day, or how much, like, if I had gum earlier in the day, if I used mouthwash that day, like, those impact my ability to taste whiskey more than the kind of glass that I'm using. And even if I'm, like, knocking back a high proof, sometimes I want to use this guy because I feel like it just helps the whiskey mellow out more than that Glencairn. But this also, I mean, it's a really cool glass. So, 99 times out of 100 when I'm drinking whiskey in the evening, it's this guy or this guy. Or some variation of the squat heavy bottom. I also have this guy, which I like a lot. It's monogrammed. My best man gave me this at his wedding when I was his best man. So, Solomon, thanks, man. Still use this. I appreciate it. So glassware, find a glass and pour whiskey in it. You should be fine. Step number 3, you've got your whiskey. You've poured it in something. You're crushing it so far. Step number 3 is build your tasting vocabulary. And you actually just, like, whiskey can be next to the party here. It's actually not how you build your vocabulary. When we talk about whiskey tasting notes, we generally talk about them in 4 categories. I'm going to get really technical on this one. I might make a penis joke later, who knows, but we'll stick with our technical stuff right now. So sweetness, spiciness, woodiness, and then surprise. I'll give you a second to guess the last one. Do you know what it is? It's like floral characteristics. So sweet, spicy, woody, floral. Generally, if you're talking about bourbon tasting notes, they're going to fall into one of those 4 categories. So how do we learn how to decipher what kind of sweetness or what kind of spiciness or what floral characteristics or what kind of wood even is present in the tasting notes? Well, you taste a whole bunch of sweet things, a whole bunch of spicy things, you sniff a bunch of flowers, and you lick some wood. Maybe not in that order. But that's what I'd recommend, is you taste a whole bunch of stuff. So sweetness, generally you're talking about brown sugar, caramel, or if you're really pretentious, you can say caramel, which I just find annoying. If that's you, good for you, but it's always caramel for me. It's spelled caramel, so I totally understand, but I'm gonna say caramel. Brown sugar, caramel, maple, and vanilla. Like those ones show up a lot. And if you want to get really fancy, things like nougat or marzipan, which is almond candy, roasted nuts kind of play in between spicy and sweet. You can do that, but let's start with the real basic ones. Get yourself some caramel, some brown sugar, some vanilla. Add a little sugar to your vanilla extract. And maple syrup, and taste those things and be like, okay, I see the difference here. Compare them to each other. And then go to your whiskey and take a sip of it. And be like, the sweetness most closely matches one of those 4 things. That's how you do it. You'll get dialed in pretty quick. The more you taste things and are aware of what you're tasting, the more you'll be able to pick them out in your whiskey. So that's sweetness. Spiciness, number 2. Generally with spiciness, we're seeing cinnamon, that's a big one. Allspice, dill, rye, obviously. Sometimes you'll see fennel, cocoa. There's one I'm just missing. It goes in rye bread. Rye. The stuff that they put in rye bread. Sue me. Just blanking right now. I didn't write down all those notes. Do the same thing. Lay them out. Sniff them. Lick them. Very minimally. Just a little bit on the tip of your finger will do. A little goes a long way. Black pepper too, actually. Some pepper. That shows up more in Scotch, actually, I've found. Heavy black pepper. But it could still show up in a bourbon. Wood. How do you taste wood? Well, I would just be aware of the smell. Of course, bourbon is aged in oak, so it's all going to taste like oak. But I've had very cedary bourbons. Of course, did they touch cedar? No. But they smelled and tasted like cedar, so that's what I would put as the tasting note more than oak. If you don't even know if you're tasting oak, which was tough for me at when I got into whiskey, is people say, I'm tasting oak. I'm like, that's cool. This is oak. That was actually kind of sweet. I don't know why. But what does oak taste like? I don't know. I think the tasting note that people generally call oak is that charredness. And charcoal is actually pretty good comparison. So very, very oaky bourbons tend to taste a lot like charcoal. So put a little charcoal up on your tongue, and that's a really heavily oaked bourbon. Is going to have some reminiscence to the charcoal you just licked. Not recommending you eat charcoal, but another way to differentiate between wood types beyond the presence of char flavors in the whiskey is to buy 3 or 4 different kinds of wood: oak, maple, cedar, cherry wood, and just run those things through your table saw, and don't snort the sawdust, but those different smells will be like, oh, well, this bourbon has some aromatic characteristics that are more reminiscent of cherry wood over oak. Not, again, that they use cherry wood, but that's what I'm smelling / tasting right now. Cedar, too, is really hard to miss, as many of you know. So get yourself some wood. Finally, floral characteristics. When you think floral, don't necessarily think about like the hydrangeas in the backyard. Think about things that generally show up in tea. So herbal components. Things like jasmine, honeysuckle, even white tea, roses. If you don't like tea, that's fine. But go get yourself a jasmine tea. Go get yourself rose whatever, rose water. You can actually soak rose petals in hot water, make rose water, and then you won't ever miss rose again. Most of the time if I get rose, it's actually in 4 roses. I think that's mainly a mental thing. Not that it's not a floral whiskey, it totally is, but when you tell somebody you're going to taste rose, you can't not taste rose. Our brains are mushy. But again, get some stuff, lay it out, give it a snort, and have your friends over. Hold your pinkies like this as you pick up your little vessels to give them a sniff. It'll be good for you as a bourbon drinker. Most bourbon drinkers tend to be a little high on the machismo. Be good for you to get in touch with your sensitive side. Embrace it. It won't hurt, I promise. You'll probably be nicer because of it. Once you've tasted those 4 flavor categories and you feel like, okay, I've got my bearings a little bit here. I can discern between rose and honeysuckle. I can discern between cocoa and rye or dill and rye. I can discern between caramel and brown sugar. Great. You can actually sound relatively educated as you try and say, in this particular whiskey, I taste this. It still might get a little bit tough, though, because when you're having a glass of whiskey, you're generally not going to be sitting around a table full of spices, herbs, and other flavor components. So what I recommend is sit around a table full of different whiskeys. So it might be helpful if I want to try and pick out some flavor notes in my Elijah Craig to compare it to something. Like, oh, am I tasting oak, or is it lightly oaked, or is it heavily oaked? What kind of sweetness? Is it brown sugar, or is it caramel? Well, let's compare it to something else. So I've got Blanton's here, which we've got Heaven Hill and Buffalo Trace distilleries, different distilleries, so I'm probably going to get some different tasting notes out of this. And I just want to compare the two. Say this one tastes more, another sweet note, honey, which I tend to get in Buffalo Trace products, or marshmallow. If I'm just assessing sweetness here, there's a big proof difference between the two, but if I'm just assessing sweetness, I do tend to get very light, like lighter here. It's not heavy like char caramelization stuff. So vanilla, honey, pretty much always in more lightly aged Buffalo Trace products like Blanton's, 6 to 8 years or so. 12-year Elijah Craig, I expect a little bit more. This one is not particularly sweet. It's not very caramely. I mean, it's heavy. It's really heavy char kind of flavors. So in the sweetness, I align it more to brown sugar. This one's softer, daintier. This one a little bit more intense, darker. It's like the difference between a light roasted coffee and a dark roasted coffee. We can also say, after we've compared the sweetness, well, let's compare the spiciness. Okay? Like, not at all. That's pretty standard for Buffalo Trace. Very, very low rye in their mash bill. Not that Heaven Hill is high rye generally in their standard mash bill, but you'll generally see spicy flavors follow the quantity of rye in the mash bill. So this one is spicier, but it's not on the herbaceous side of spicy. It's more just a suggestion of cinnamon with more allspice. That's what I would say here. Very, very low spice, not getting much at all here. cinnamon and allspice in this one. Woody, that one's easy. This one clearly has spent more time in the wood. It likes the wood. Whereas this one just feels really well balanced. This, I get the sort of charcoal finish and feeling on my tongue. It's a little drier, leaves your mouth a little dry, charcoaliness. Whereas this one just is like mouth coating. This is really good. This is really good. This is Benny's pick from a while ago, barrel 406. Finally, Floral Characteristics. They don't always show up in bourbon, or it can be really tough to pick out florals. So if you don't get anything, fine, nobody cares. And that's one thing I'd say while we're talking about whiskey tasting is you don't want to sound like a butthole. Like, it's easy in a whiskey tasting to sit here and spin your whiskey around like a ding-dong and look like you're a Scotch person. I get the essence of the sweat of the distillers, and you can taste like that this went into the barrel at 107 proof because of the effervescence on your tongue hole. Like, no, come on, like, shut your face and just be like, this is dang good. It's pretty sweet. I get more vanilla. What do you taste? Yeah, I would have said like amber honey. All right, cool. Stuff that people know. Nothing's worse than somebody who's a taster and they're gonna throw some bullcrap tasting notes at you. Like, one thing in coffee, you know, it's a lot of fruity notes actually in coffee when you roast it light. So you could say, I taste sweet lemon. It's a citrus flavor. We get that a lot in coffee. Very, very citrusy. So it's sweet and citrusy. It's a sweet lemon. But there's a bunch of weird varieties of lemons, like a Meyer lemon, which nobody knows what that is. And if we put that on a coffee bag and tell somebody we're tasting Meyer lemon, people might say like, oh, that's really interesting that you claim to know what you're talking about, but nobody knows what the heck that is. So just be plain and be simple. But this exercise overall will just help you be like, oh, I know Elijah Craig is really going to punch me in the face and be delicious while it does it. Well, I know that Blanton's is softer, and if I want something more chill, more sweet, less spicy, I'm going to go with this guy. It'll really help you just kind of dial in to the distilleries that deliver on the profiles that you want. I think that's more the point than anything else. All right, so let's wrap it up. How to get really good at tasting and articulating what you taste in whiskey. This is homework, and you're gonna love it. Taste a lot of whiskey, which at home you can just lay out all your open bottles and taste a little bit from each one and compare them, maybe take a couple of notes. Or what I said in my last video, host a tasting, which is awesome. You just make other people bring you whiskey that you can then taste and broaden your palate. They also get to taste your whiskey too, so kind of goes around. But if you taste thoughtfully, what am I tasting and how do these compare? You will become a better taster. It just takes time. But the more you try and articulate it, the better you can do it. If you don't try it, you won't do it. You won't be very good at it. That's okay, too. If you don't want to be a whiskey taster, don't be a whiskey taster. Just drink the whiskey. Hopefully that was helpful in some way. If you liked this video, like this video. Follow me. I'm going to be doing a lot more crap like this because I got a lot of whiskey to drink, and I might as well do it on camera.